All right, so everyone, let's give a big round of applause for Brian and John, who are going to tackle their tech talk today.
Brian and John, woo!
Let's go.
John and Brian, woo!
Take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian, and I'm joined here today with John on our tech talk on React Context API. This talk is sponsored by CodeSmith and SingleSprout. Okay, so here's our agenda for today. First thing is we're going to be talking about state management and what it is and why we use it. Then we're going to introduce you guys to Context API and talk about what it is, why it's used, and how to use it. Then we're going to show you a brief demo on how to use Context API. Then we're going to compare it with Redux. And then we're going to end with a recap on everything. So what is state management? In order to define what state management is, we have to first define state. And state is a private and fully controlled object in a component that holds information or data that can be passed to other components through the use of props, which then brings us to state management. State management is a process of dealing with or controlling these states. It becomes very useful, especially when it comes to more complex applications, because it gives the users the ability to have control over their state. State management tools provide the users the ability to access the state, whether to use or edit the state. And why use state management tools? So by using state management tools, we are able to access the state easily within all child level components in the app. Also, many of you might be familiar with the term prop drilling. Well, by using these state management tools, we are able to prevent users from having to prop drill to child components because, as you know, that could definitely get out of hand really quick. And I will be showing briefly what prop drilling looks like compared to using Context API in the demo a little bit later. And so with that, I'll pass it over to John for intro to Context API.
Thank you, Brian. So what is React Context API? React Context is a state management tool used in React, and it allows users to access data without the passing of props, as Brian mentioned. And so if you can see in the top part of this diagram, the state requires it to be passed down into each child component until it reaches the one that we're actually using it in. So in reality, this toolbar doesn't even use this theme dark, but the sole purpose of it being sent to this toolbar is so that it could be sent to this theme button. But with React Context API, we can simply create the context at the top level and skip this toolbar and send it directly where we need to. So how do we use Context API? So the first thing we have to do is create the context object, and we can do so with this function, create context. And the initial value or the current value of the object is going to be the argument passed into the function. So this is the syntax for it right here. And we're basically declaring a constant myContext, and we're assigning it to the invocation of create context with home passed in. And as you can see down here below, the context object is created. And the two most important things to take home from this is this current value here. As you can see, home is our current value. And these two providers and consumers. These are going to be important in the next coming slides. So one of the ways we use context is with the provider and consumers that I just mentioned. Providers give their children access to the context. And as you can see in this diagram here, the context object is created and the provider gives access to the context object to all the consumers subscribed to the provider. And we can also change the current value of the context object with providers by assigning a value to the value prop of the provider component. As we can see here, the value prop is assigned to Brian and John. And consumers subscribe to the closest provider or context object and gain access to the value. Consumers also require their children to be a function component. And this is the context for it here. As you saw in the first slide, when we created the context, we passed in the value hello. So what's happening here is that the argument for this function is going to be hello passed in. And so what is happening here is we're rendering hello in an H1 tag. And this diagram here, I think an easy way to explain how providers and consumers works is if we think of providers like, I'm going to use my mom as an example. And if she has baked some cookies for us, then that is the current value of our context. And the consumers are her children, so me and my brother. And they have access to what is currently stored in the cookie jar, which is the context object. Another way we can use context is with the use context function. If you use this function, you can simply grab what the current value of the context or context provider is. And as you can see here below, this is the syntax to grab the value. So we're just going to assign value to the invocation of use context with my context passed in. And that's just going to give us the value that's currently stored in current value. And with that, I'm going to pass to Brian for our demonstration.
Can you end the screen share? I can't screen share. Okay. So I'll be demonstrating how React Context API works. But before that, I want to quickly demo how prop drilling works so that we could have something to compare it to. So here we are using hooks to set a string to this initial value. And this initial value is using this context object's current value nav, and then setting nav context to be the value. And then here nav context, we are, like I said, creating a context object to set the current value to be home. And so essentially the string becomes a string home. Yeah, so don't worry too much about this create context part of it right now. Yeah, I'll explain that a little bit more in detail later. But so the string here, we are passing it down into this grandpa component from great grandpa component. And then we're destructuring it out here and then passing it down again here, destructuring it and then passing it down, destructuring it here. And then we can simply just render onto the page string and we get this home right here. So as you guys can see, this is a very tedious method. And yeah, it just takes a lot of time. So let me get rid of all of these. Give me just a second. Okay. Then I'm just gonna get set up with the next step. All right, so here we have just a simple app that we created and with 3 buttons that'll take us to different pages within this app. And we wanted to focus more on the context API part of this. So like so we just didn't build the whole app from but so before I explain this code, let's take Facebook, for example. When you go on to facebook.com, it takes you to the login page. And if you log in correctly, it takes you to a different page with your feed. However, if you don't log in correctly, it asks you to log in again. So by using context, we are able to determine if a user is logged in and then render the page with whatever you wanted to render it with. If the user is not able to log in, we can set the default value of context to be false, so it won't necessarily change anything. All right, so let's take a look at the code. I will explain both ways to use context. So the first thing is we are assigning, the first thing, of course, is to import use context and create context from React. That's very important. And then we are assigning user context to be the context object's current value, with false being its default value. And then here we are using this user context provider to pass to its value prop the string Brian and John. And as you can see deep down into this child component, we are able to use this context.consumer, which takes a function as a child and as its and we can pass in this user, which is this value Brian and John. And we're just simply rendering onto the page this user. So if I were to save this, it's gonna print out Brian and John onto the page. So yeah, this is the first way to use context. And as you can see, it's important to note here that context.consumer will take the closest provider's value props value and render that onto the page in our case. So if I were to uncomment this out, we will be seeing the value Nicole on this page instead of Brian and John. And if I save it, there we go. We see Nicole on the page. Yeah, so that is the first way. The second way that we can use context is the first part of it is the same. The only difference is that we can define this user. So we're basically grabbing the value passed into the nearest context provider's value prop and passing it to a variable user with the use context function. So in our case, if I were to save this again, and I would have to just uncomment this out. So what we're doing is we're just rendering onto the page this user. And if I were to save this, it's going to give me the value Nicole because that's the closest to this use context. However, if I were to comment this out, then it should print out Brian and John. And yeah, so that is two ways to use the context, and that is the end of our demo. And I'll pass it back over to John for a comparison to Redux.
All right, great demonstration. So comparison to Redux. First, why are we comparing it to Redux? And I think we just need to talk a little bit about what Redux is. And Redux is also a state management tool / library. And the reason why we're comparing it to Context API, or why we're comparing Context API to Redux, is because it's more well known and it's been around a little bit longer than Context API. So the first comparison is that React Context API re-renders components that are subscribed or use the context object. So it's basically going to, as you saw in Brian's demonstration, the create context with false passed in, that's going to render first. Even though we have the H1 tag at the bottom with user passed in, if those providers weren't there, or even with the providers there, it's first going to render false, and then it's very quickly going to render Brian and John. So it's going to re-render that. Redux, however, on the other hand, it only re-renders components that use state that was updated. So for example, if our state was a huge object and we have a component that's using a key in that object, and that key is the only thing that's changed in that object, that component is the only one that's going to be re-rendered. And they might sound a little bit similar, but if you use React context a little bit carelessly, then it can become very expensive to use. React context is very lightweight in comparison to Redux. As you saw in the demonstration, the only thing we had imported and used as a dependency was React. Redux, on the other hand, is a huge library. There's a lot of setting up to do. There's map state to props, there's map dispatch to props, there's connect, the reducer, state, etc., etc. React context is a little bit newer than Redux, so there's not a lot of debugging that's been done with it. Whereas Redux has been around for a while, there's a lot of dev tools for it. There's time travel and other useful tools with that you can use with Redux. But the most important thing to note is that both of these take away the need to prop drill. As we dove deeper into our research with React Context, we realized that the similarities with Redux there's a lot of similarities. As of React Redux version 6, access to Redux's store is handled by a context object generated by React, basically React context. And the reducer function, state, action, you can have all of that inside of React context as well. And the way to use this is with the use reducer function to bind the reducer and state in React context. And Context API uses both Flux and Redux design patterns. So the similarities, we found so many similarities. In conclusion, when should I use or learn React Context API? React Context API is great for small to medium-sized applications, and they're most efficient when they're used with hooks. And Context API, in our opinion, is a little bit easier to use and implement compared to Redux. So for juniors, if you guys are gonna start your project soon, and you have like 2 days to make your project, we don't recommend using Redux because it might take the entire 2 days to set up your Redux. Yeah. And React Context API is also useful when you have some data or state that you need throughout your entire application. And that is our presentation. There's our references and any questions.
Hey guys, I have a question. Could you just give us a real life example of why you would want to use Context API and maybe talk about like the data that you would want in your state?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So Brian mentioned Facebook, and so I'll talk a little bit more about Facebook. So a type of data Facebook would need is their user information. So Brian mentioned how when a user logs in, the home page is no longer the login page, but the user's feed. So so within our components, there will be like the nav bar, there will be the buddy list, there will be like messages and the profile, about us, all those things. But those components are nested deeply inside the application. And in order for them to actually display something, that user information needs to be passed down all the way. But with React Context, we can simply have it at the top level application when we log in. And now we can just simply call it with like use context or the consumers. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a question too. So you mentioned that you would use Context API for small to medium-sized applications. How scalable is Context API?
Yeah, so I can answer that question. So yeah, like we briefly talked about before, React Context API is great for small to medium-sized applications. And that's simply because although it's a very powerful tool, it hasn't been around long enough like Redux, which means that many bugs can still exist. Redux, however, has been around much longer than Context API. So in a way, it's safer to use compared to Context API because there's just been more trial and error. Also, Context API is often used with hooks, and there are certain quirks about hooks that make it difficult to use for some developers. Some of the hook quirks are it can only be called in functional components. They have to be used in the same order as it was rendered. And they are not allowed to be called in conditionals or loops. But overall, just Context API by itself, as you've seen through the demo, it works great.
I actually have a question as well. Could you guys speak to maybe like some of like a use case where you would want to use Redux over Context API or like the other way around, like for specific functionality?
Yeah, I can take this question. So your question is like, basically, why would you use Redux instead of React Context, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So as Brian mentioned about the scalability thing, Redux has been around for a lot longer. So there's like a lot more tools that you can use with Redux. For example, like the time traveling, that's like a very powerful tool that is like Redux. It's only specific to Redux. So especially for like large scale applications, it can get crazy trying to like import context everywhere. And so, yeah, like, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Any questions out there? All right, yeah, let's just give one last round of applause for John and Brian's talk.
Yeah. Let's go.
Enjoy dinner, everyone. Thank you all for coming.
You.